You're watching The Healing Properties of Medicinal Mushrooms by Dr. Alyssa Gall on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Review series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. So welcome to The Healing Properties of Medicinal Mushrooms. This should be a fun webinar. I really was re-inspired to learn a little bit more about mushrooms. I have had a wonderful relationship to mushrooms for a long time. I did actually, in my university years as an undergraduate, buy The Mushroom Cultivator, which is one of the first books that was written on that subject by Paul Stamets, who's very well known as a researcher. And we're going to see some of his research tonight, but it cracked me up to be reminded of those days where I thought I might just grow mushrooms on the side for like a side job. But I didn't do that. So let's get this party started. Hopefully you can see my slides. Everybody should be able to see the slide change here. So our lecture on mushrooms today comes under Alleviate from the Whole Life Medicine model. And that's the first step in health strategy at Resonance Wellness. You can see that there are other big topics that, or big sections of this model that we don't always talk about because they're a little bit harder to talk about. But Alleviate specifically is about the first step in patient guidance. And when we talk about using medicinal mushrooms, we're really talking about the starting points of this. In this particular circumstance, we're looking at the potential of mushrooms as a type of missing ingredient, and also its fascinating interactions with our biology. So let's take a look at some of those interesting reactions today. So the fungal kingdom is very amazingly related to us. In fact, mushrooms share about 50% of our DNA and are mostly more closely related to animals than plants. That's quite surprising to most people because I think we kind of mentally put these into kind of a vegetation category. The word mushroom actually might come directly from the French for field knob or another word for moss. It's also related to, obviously, like the word fungus can actually come from the Latin, I make a corpse. So there was a long-standing knowledge that mushrooms sometimes could also be quite poisonous. And we're going to talk about that today because I think when people do think about mushrooms, they think about the edible form that you get in the grocery store, and they also think about the potential for poisoning. So there is just an absolutely huge number of estimated species. If you think about 1.4 million distinct species of mushroom, 80,000 of them are named. So obviously there's a lot of naming yet to do. 14,000 are well known. 2,000 are known as safe edibles out of the ones that we've probably named and identified properly. And about 700 of those are known to be medicinal. So that means that they're actually going to have really significant pharmacological activity. We're going to take a look at a couple of handful of mushrooms today in way more detail. But I think one of the interesting places to start here is to really recognize that mushrooms are an incredibly ancient form of life, as in like predating most life forms. So microscopic fungal forms have been found in the fossil record in Russia, dating at 545 million years old. And so what you're actually seeing here is a representation of the periods that we've divided the eons of life into. And you can see here that really mushrooms are right at the juncture between the Proterozoic and the Cambrian periods. Absolutely ancient. And this is probably one of the reasons why they can be so biologically active across the spectrum, even in ourselves, whom we tend to think of as being evolved creatures. But the reality is that a lot of your biochemistry being shared with these creatures that are much more plant-like looking has this incredible applicability to processes both healthy metabolically and unhealthy metabolically. So I thought you'd be interested in seeing a specimen. This is the Prototaxites. It's a Saudi Arabian phosphol that dating from about 420 to 350 million years ago. And you can see in this picture, I hope you can see it well on your screen. It's the guy is basically squatting at the base of this massive mushroom-like structure. And you have to remember that this existed when there were no backboned animals and very small scaled plants. Like this thing is massive. The thought is that this particular organism would have been up to 24 feet high and as wide as 3 feet. This was, I believe, reported by the National Geographic in about 2007. And it took people a while to figure out what this thing was. But again, they think it's a fungus. So at this time, when there were no backboned animals, you got to think like there's like literally no backboned animals having come out of the ocean yet. And so there were some vascular plants. So that's kind of like the kind of plant that you and I would be familiar with. But the tallest would maybe have been a couple of feet high. So to see this massive mushroom fungus thing in the environment would have probably been very predominant. So we didn't actually see that kind of life for another, at least 25 million years. It's absolutely amazing. So the first research on Prototaxites was actually in 1859 by a Canadian paleontologist who based his research on specimens he found along the shores of the Gaspé in Quebec. So long history, really not well elucidated and really only recently recognized for the incredible time frame and relatability to us. It's actually fascinating. This is just the hugest mushroom I can even imagine. Now, weren't just big when they were at this time period, but they are also continue to be large, not in their small fruiting forms, because this, you have to remember, a fungus is a fruiting form. But the oldest and biggest organisms on Earth at present are actually thought to be mushrooms. And here's the largest organism on Earth. According to science, it's a giant colony of honey mushrooms that's at over 2,200 acres, and it's at least 2,400 years old. That's pretty amazing. This is at the Malheur National Forest in Oregon. This is kind of the topographical maps that you can just see how much area we're talking about. And at the lower left there's a picture of the outlines of the ring of these this huge mycelial mat. And at the upper left, you can see, just how big this is in relationship to the whole state of Oregon. You can see at least where it is there. So absolutely amazing. It just grows and spreads primarily underground. And so the sheer bulk of that organism is really in the earth, out of sight in the form of these mycelia. And you can see these hands are holding mycelial structures. And then occasionally during fall, this particular specimen will send up golden colored honey mushrooms all the way around this massive periphery. So it's so fascinating to think this form of life might have predated most others and that it's so much more related to us than you might think. And so obviously probably related to the profound things that it can do to us and for us. Now, historically, there's actually a lot of evidence for the use of mushrooms and other fungi by various populations on the earth. The oldest images are in caves dated at 5,000 before the Common Era in Algeria. And sorry, it's not the best image. It's the black and white image. And I don't know if you can see my pointer. I don't think you can. But there's this kind of like man-like creature with a mushroom-like head there, and he's holding a little mushroom in his hands. Do you see there's two guys that I can see here, and they both have little mushrooms being held in their hands. This is considered to be one of the oldest representations um, of of mushrooms in existence. The Egyptians also called mushrooms sons of the gods and plants of immortality. And they thought that the storm god Set actually created them by hurling lightning bolts coated in mushroom seed to earth. And consuming mushrooms was the exclusive privilege of a pharaoh and his dining companions. And so there are hieroglyphs carved probably about 4,600 years ago, forbidding common men from even touching mushrooms because they were strictly for the highborn. And the pharaoh, Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza around 4,500 years ago, absolutely adored truffles, and the royal table was apparently always supplied with very rare desert-born truffles. And interestingly, the Mexicans have a similar historic view of mushrooms coming from the union of lightning and earth. So it would be interesting to see if there actually is a relationship, between, maybe lightning storms and where mushrooms grow, or you never know. A lot of the time in these old folk perceptions, there's always grains of truth in it. Now, there's also recorded treatises on mushrooms by Dioscorides. He was one of the original Roman physicians. And so that's 400 years before Christ. And he just noted they're either edible or they're poisonous, no middle ground. The Chinese also have a long history with mushrooms that dates back about 7,000 years. Although I think the oldest written record is Indian, and it's about 3,000 years old. So just a huge amount of human-mushroom interaction over time. Now, we are very far behind in the mushroom harvest department in this country. In Finland, the estimated wild mushroom crop is 5 billion kilograms a year. The government actually has a policy of encouraging wild harvesting since World War II, and it's estimated that about 72% of Finnish adults will pick mushrooms. So they actually did training programs to show people what they could eat in their forest, and so it's actually become part of the culture now. And you can also see this in the markets in Europe. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to go to markets in Europe, but in Switzerland, as an example, there's 78 official market mushrooms. In Sweden, there's 300. In Germany, there's 30. And it always seems to me, I've been in the markets in Germany, it always seems like there's more than 30, but it's just a plethora of freshly picked wild harvested mushrooms for the most part. I'm sure some of them are grown, but there's just such a huge tradition of going into the forest and finding these. And so here in Canada, we have plenty of mushrooms in the forest, and we're going to talk about a couple of them that are really significant that you could potentially use and find, but we really don't see this much at all. So it's very easy to actually use mushrooms. A lot of the mushrooms that we use that are medicinal are not really great for eating, not like the button mushroom as an example. So in order to properly extract what you need out of the mushrooms, you have to heat them for about 30 minutes to pull out these complex types of branch chain polysaccharides. It's a kind of sugar molecule out of the mushroom. And if you do that for long enough, you will get basically a pretty good, mushroom colored tea out of it. This is a pretty typical color here that we're showing. It usually comes out a like muddy brown color. And so in essence, you can make your own extracts from mushrooms easily by boiling enough to reduce volume. And then what you actually do to make an extract, just so you know, because I don't know about you guys, but I've seen plenty of patients come with mushroom extracts. They can be very expensive, but the essence of them is this. You boil mushroom tea for long enough, um, usually at least, 30 minutes. It depends a little bit on the mushroom. And then you simmer down this water extract until it's about a tenth of the original volume. And then use a carrier powder. And there's lots you can use. Like you can use herbal powders like Siberian ginseng root powder or nettle powder. Lots of commercial producers use maltodextrin or methylcellulose or kudzu starch. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's a kind of starch made from a grain. And basically any kind of low fat starch. And then the carrier absorbs that concentrated down liquid, and that you make basically a batter into that. And you can pour that into a fruit leather tray of a dehydrator. And then at about 100 degrees or below, you can heat it up, and overnight it dries. And you can basically make this concentrated mushroom extract powder. This is basically how traditional extracts are made. So a lot of the time people assume the extracts are actually powdered mushrooms, but they're not. They're not. It's not actually the important part of the mushroom. And if you find people selling powdered mushrooms, it's not the same as making an extract of these polysaccharides, which are the active part of mushrooms. So, and like I said, easy to make yourself if you're kind of a do-it-yourselfer. You could easily make a mushroom extract from fresh mushrooms, and it's much cheaper. So there you go. That's the recipe in a nutshell. So why are mushrooms medicinal? There's a couple of main reasons probably why, and I've written them down here for you. First of all, mushrooms are amazing at scavenging in the environment. They're really digest and bring nutrients in by excreting out enzymes into the environment, dissolving whatever it is that they're close to, and then bringing that digested stuff into themselves. So it's kind of like, throwing out your stomach outside of yourself. Kind of like flies do. Flies do the same thing. They kind of spit on something, dissolve it up, and then suck it up with their little straw proboscises. That's what a mushroom basically does. So it's like an animal, like a very rudimentary animal like procedure for getting nutrition. Now, those same products that they excrete to do the scavenging are often also very antiviral, antibacterial, antiprotozoal, and antifungal. And the reason for that is, like any organism that has to compete in a large, multi-creature environment, when you secrete things that can inhibit other populations, you just increase your own survival. But as a consequence, a lot of the compounds that we find inside mushrooms that are so valuable to us as human medicines are there because the mushroom is basically making molecules to defend itself. And we're just taking advantage of that. We do the exact same thing when we use antibiotics. An antibiotic is usually a molecule that a fungus or another bacteria has created against an organism. And we use that secreted product as a therapeutic agent to decrease populations of bacteria. It's no different. Now, the ones that we use, of course, nowadays can be very strong and very concentrated when we take one or two molecules that are like that. And so there are risks inherent in using them as purified agents. But in a mushroom extract, you're just basically getting a whole range of different things that have this quality to them. But they're not directly killing agents all the time, and not in the human context. And we'll talk about this in a moment. So what we'll talk about right now, they're full of really unique immune system modulating sugars. So those same things that we're using the tea to extract are these beautiful big molecules that when they come in contact with our immune cells, actually help our immune cells be stimulated to produce things like cytokines, interleukins, tumor necrosis factors. These are molecules that your immune system is actively using in its immune response. And of course, we very recently heard about cytokines in terms of the cytokine storms of COVID-19. And in essence, what that is a type of normal inflammatory reaction to an infection. And so these mushrooms have some of those same provoking qualities. There's also a major constituent of many medicinal mushrooms called beta glucan. That's a particular polysaccharide, and it's extremely good at stimulated gut-associated lymph node tissue. So there's a very good chance that there's some interactions with our microbiome, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, why are some mushrooms poisonous? This is always the question because people keep trying to make rules about how do you tell if a mushroom is poisonous. For the most part, trial and error basically comes with its own expenses, but there are some well-known toxic mushrooms. This here is an Amanita phalloides. This is a death cap. Most people have heard of this mushroom. This is just showing us a particular sample next to a matchbox here for scale. And in essence, in this particular mushroom, there's a toxin called an amatoxin. And what it does is it's a potent and very selective inhibitor of RNA polymerase II. So RNA is a type of messenger genetic material. So when you are making products for cellular use, you often will read a particular message off of DNA by using RNA as an encoder. And so without this messenger RNA, which is the template for protein synthesis, the products that your cell needs for metabolism can stop if the toxin is present and creating a problem in producing this kind of messenger RNA. And when your cell metabolism stops, then all your repair stops and all your building stops. And at the end of the day, you have cell lysis. So this particular fungus, like I said, is highly toxic. It's responsible for the majority of fatal mushroom poisonings worldwide. As a result, the biochemistry has been researched pretty intensively for decades. About 30 grams or about 1 ounce or half a cap of this mushroom is estimated to be enough to kill a human. And typically there'll be, like a dozen people around the world probably poisoned per year. On average, one person dies a year in North America from death cap ingestion. Ironically, it's probably not native to North America, but so it's probably been carried here by early travel. And it seems to appear mainly on the west and east coastal regions. So I don't think I've ever seen one of these here. And they're very nondescript looking. I mean, if you look at this mushroom, it doesn't say toxic all over it by any stretch of the imagination. Sometimes they're a little bit greenish. This particular sample, you can see it has this kind of vague greenish tinge to it. But you'd be hard pressed to probably identify that if you're not a great mushroom identifier in a forest environment. Now, most of the time, this particular death cap, it's when you eat it and you take it into your digestion, most of what you eat first ends up in the liver. That's true regardless of what you're eating. Your liver gets first pick of everything that you eat. And that's because your liver is the thing that's manufacturing a lot of molecules and doing detox processes for which it requires all this nutrition. So when you eat a death cap, you're basically bringing in this toxin to one of the most metabolically active organs in your entire body. And so it doesn't kill you immediately. It actually takes a little bit of time because, like I said, you have to intoxicate this mRNA producing enzyme, and then slowly, like, your whole capacity to self-repair ceases. And the first day, most people will rally and feel like they're getting better. But then by the second day, there's significant damage done. Now, what's interesting is that you can use a silybenin or silymarin from milk thistle. It actually prevents the uptake of these toxins by liver cells, and it can protect undamaged liver tissue. And it can also stimulate some of the RNA polymerases to be produced in more volume. So patients who start the milk thistle within 96 hours of ingesting the mushroom, and who still had intact kidney function will survive. Um, so that research was done in February of 2014. I don't think there's been another study repeating that, but it's interesting because there are things that you can do if you know about them. And of course, the easiest way of getting that compound into somebody is by IV. And most people don't realize that that exists. But in Europe, it's a very commonly used drug for mushroom poisoning. So there you go. Just destroys cells from the inside out. And like I said, there's probably a very significant relationship to the microbiome. It's highly likely that a major effect of mushrooms is on the balance of the microbiome in your gut. If you've never heard that expression before, the microbiome is basically the totality of the ecosystem of microorganisms that are located inside your gastrointestinal tract. We did do a webinar on that several months back when we talked about digestion. And so you can always go and take a look at that replay if you're interested in that. There's just an incredible balance of species that work with you to metabolize things that you're not really that great at metabolizing. And obviously mushrooms do some of that as well. So what's interesting is that there's a lot of prebiotic substance, that polysaccharide, combined with very antibiotic substances. And so it remains to be seen what the research will show about the effect of mushrooms on the microbiome. Now, of course, you don't have to go all the way into the forest to get the effect of mushrooms. You could eat your medicine with mushrooms. So here's a handful of relatively easy to procure mushrooms that are very popular in cooking. The one to the left is the morel mushroom. I don't know if you realize that, but Canada actually has amazing morel populations. This is a kind of mushroom that's found in burn sites. And so a morel hunter, will be able to harvest varying with the fire season and with rainfall, typically. So as an example, like the eruption of Mount St. Helens many decades ago produced huge quantities of morels. We don't have any volcanoes locally, but we do tend to have a lot of forest burns. And if you know what you're looking for and where to look, you can find these mushrooms. And they actually are sometimes a jealously guarded secret, where you can find the morels. And they're extremely tasty. You do have to cook them, however. They do have a bit of a toxin in them, and the fumes of cooking morels can be a bit dangerous. But you have to use good ventilation. But when you cook them, they have a beautiful earthy taste. Now, shiitakes are very familiar to many people. They're readily available dried. They are very antiviral. They're antihypertensive. They help blood sugar regulation. And shiitakes have been researched in breast cancer. And again, easy to procure. You can also get growing kits for shiitake. So you can get basically a mushroom compost block that's got spores embedded in it, and just keep it damp, and it'll produce shiitakes for quite some time if you take care of it. Oyster mushrooms, also very easy to procure. I just got some from Co-op not too long ago. Organic oyster mushrooms. They are very active at reducing cholesterol. They're antiviral, including to HIV. They're antacid and they're anti-cancer. And enokis, which are these small, tall bunches of mushrooms, usually they're sold kind of in a clump like this. They are similar in action. So you can easily incorporate these kinds of mushrooms. The button mushroom really is kind of, I don't know, I think about it in my mind as the Wonder Bread of mushrooms. It's not really that complex. And they actually contain a toxin that can cause cancer if you eat too many of them raw. And portobellas, they're just a bigger, meatier version of the button mushroom. They really also too should be cooked. I don't know where we got this penchant for raw button mushrooms. I kind of remember, I don't know how many of you are from Alberta originally, but there was like that buffet place. What was it called? Like Mother Tucker's or something. I think it only died as a restaurant maybe 15 years ago even. It used to be on 10th Avenue. And it was like this big buffet. And I just remember there being a lot of like raw sliced button mushrooms on those kinds of on those kinds of buffets. But like I said, not necessarily the tastiest mushroom. And if you like button mushrooms, fried up, you'll probably find any of these other ones more complex in taste and also, reasonably easy to procure and use. Now let's take a look at some of the main mushrooms that we can easily get a hold of. So this is the reishi mushroom. This is known as the divine or spiritual mushroom in Eastern medicine, and it's had a known use for 4,000 years, even though it doesn't really grow everywhere in Southeast Asia. It was really identified as being a valuable medicinal mushroom. Now, the Latin term for it is Ganoderma lucidum. So, gan actually means shiny, and derm means skin. And of course, it's a very shiny. You can kind of see it on this picture. It's not as clear, but you see how much light is reflecting off the right side and the left side here of these specimens. It's an incredibly shiny topped mushroom. And in Chinese, it's known as Lingji. It means spirit plant or tree of life in Chinese. Now, it has a lot of actions. It's adaptogenic, which means that it actually improves your resilience to stress, basically then improving sleep and autonomic nervous system activity. So an adaptogen is something that helps you if you get too mentally or physically stressed, and it help you increase functions that are not going so well, or decrease it when, say, as an example, you have too much stress hormone circulating in your body. Secondly, it acts on cytochrome P53. This is a gene that's involved in your biology with the identification of abnormal cells. So it helps you to helps your body to actually identify things that should be destroyed, cells that should be destroyed. So if you have a properly functioning gene at P53, you actually have a better chance of eliminating abnormal cells. So as a result, it can be preventative to cancer. Now, it's also useful if the cancer is already there and established. So it's been shown to be useful in prostate cancer. It can also help viral hepatitis. And in one study where they used reishi in hepatitis B, that's the form that you get from IV drug abuse and using shared needles, or there are people who've had hepatitis B from a blood transfusion before it was identified that you could get those viruses from blood transfusion. That, or you also can get this from risk-oriented sexual behaviors. So in this study, in 6 months, a third of the patients had normal liver enzyme values, and 13% of them had completely cleared the viral load using reishi mushroom. So it's actually an incredible potential treatment. Now, it's approved in China for myasthenia gravis. What myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune type of thyroid condition. And so you are going to see this kind of repetitive theme here where there's this incredible immune regulating capacity, even if it's autoimmune. So, what did I just said it was thyroid. I apologize. I don't mean thyroid. I mean neuromuscular. It reminds me of a different term, but basically when you get this particular disease, you can get skeletal muscle weakness, and people actually start to lose control of like muscles and the eyes and the face and swallowing. So it's not a disease for which there are many cures. So here, a beautiful potential example of a cure. It's also very useful in chronic bronchitis, and can stabilize food sensitivity. I think I think I came across a statistic that if you have chronic bronchitis, you could show improvement in about 2 weeks, 60 to 90% of people using reishi. Now, part of that may also just be the adaptogenic part where you're improving the stress. Part of it might be the immunological part. Hard to know. I don't think they specifically figured out why. It's also pretty anti-inflammatory, and it helps arteriosclerosis and cholesterol issues and hypertension. And again, we're going to see this repeated in the different kinds of mushrooms. They just have some of these key areas where they're just brilliant helpers for cardiovascular, diabetes, cancer, and immune problems. And different mushrooms just have different emphasis. So let's look at the next one. So this is another one that's become a little bit more popular in recent years. It's called lion's mane. And lion's mane, you can kind of see, the French actually call it pom-pom du blanc, which means like white pom-pom, kind of like on a toque. It is very edible and very tasty. And they do eat it a lot across the world. But it is very well known for having not just anti-cancer effects that I'm listing here, but it's one of the only mushrooms that have been shown to induce nerve growth factor. And so it's been known to help improve brain function if it's taken continuously. It improves demyelination, like as in multiple sclerosis, and it may actually be useful in many of the dementias, including Alzheimer's. It's also known to be quite helpful in anxiety and depression. And in fact, this molecule here that I've kind of highlighted for you, the erinacines, this actually looks a lot like the structure of some of the antidepressants, interestingly. It's also great in blood sugar and lipid regulation and gastric ulceration. And unfortunately, it is one of these mushrooms where you do tend to have to take it repetitively. And this is probably because it's having an impact on a number of different body systems, all of the mechanisms of which are clearly not discovered yet. But it was found that the effect on brain function would wane after about 4 weeks, even though it was marked and notable. If you couldn't just take it and then not take it after the fact, you have to take it repetitively. So fascinating and very particular to the nervous system and brain function. Now, the turkey tail, lots of people have heard of the turkey tail mushroom. This mushroom was actually studied at my alma mater, Bastyr, which has an NIH-funded research department, where they did some studies showing that breast cancer was found to be helped with turkey tail extract. And this actually does grow in Alberta. There's hundreds of studies in its use as immune supportive adjunctive treatment to chemo, radiation, and there's a particular extract from turkey tail that is known as PSK. And over 25% of the money spent on natural cancer support in Japan is for PSK. In one study, the use of PSK in radiation in lung cancer increased survival by 400% of those patients that were treated. So 70% of this extract is actually secreted through the lungs. So it can be used if the liver is failing or the kidney is failing. It's not just one more drug that you're adding that can worsen liver or kidney failure, which is very common, in chronic diseases where quality and length of life are becoming an issue. Now, this is also very useful in autoimmune disorders. It's very immunomodulative. What I'm talking about here would be things like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. It also helps a lot if there's antibiotic resistance to use this particular mushroom adjunctively to an antimicrobial. It is also one of the most significant bioremediation mushrooms. What I mean by that, and this is some of the work that is more recent by Paul Stamets, so the guy that I bought that mushroom cultivator book from, 30 years ago, actually has done some amazing work showing that mushrooms have this incredible ability to filter things out of the environment. And his work has shown that pesticides, mercury, um, and like like PCBs, all of those kind of big hydrocarbons can be basically remediated with turkey tail and other kinds of mushrooms, but just absolutely a huge potential here for using these mushrooms to help our environment. And in fact, what they do is they take the mycelium and they heat sterilize them so they're not like, able to produce spores or reproduce, but they put them in these big, like, netted containers, and they can float them like in a contaminated water lake or stream, and literally start to clean the stuff out. I think it's just absolutely amazing, and I'm hoping we see more of that in the future. It's just it's too simple sometimes, I think. As a dose, 5 grams of PSK per day. So if you had a boiled tea, that'd be about 20 grams of this mushroom 3 times a day as a boiled tea. There's another extract, it's called PSP. You can take 3 grams of that. Now, chaga is another thing that grows in Alberta. And this is a polypore or conch. And basically, you need an axe to cut it off the tree. It's very, very hard. The Russians have used this type of fungus in cancer basically since the 16th century by record, where anytime where an operation is problematic. So there is actually an official alcohol extract for cancer therapy in Russia called bifungin. And in part, you're seeing here the chaga mushroom growing on this birch tree. And this is a very common host tree. It's not the only tree, but it's a common host tree. And because of the nature of this particular fungus, it actually concentrates a lot of the birch resins in it as well. So some of the therapeutic effect may also be coming from the birch, but it just has a huge amount of polyphenols in it. Now, you probably are familiar with polyphenols because you might have heard me talk about resveratrol, which is a kind of a bioflavonoid. So, or like you can get that in white wine and berry skins, grape skins, and there's different versions of those polyphenols that are concentrated from different foodstuffs and used, in cancer or used in tissue repair. This particular set of polyphenols in this tree have the most massive antioxidant effect, like thousands of times higher than your average antioxidant. Like I think the ORAC score of coffee, because coffee is also a polyphenol, is like maybe 2,700. So when you get 146,000, it just kind of gives you a sense of like just how big that is. Even like black raspberry juice, I think it's about 10,000. Red wine is only about 3,500. So this is a massive increase in the capacity for antioxidation. Now, of course, you can't antioxidize every reaction in your body. You need oxidation also to create certain processes normally. But, where you do need an antioxidant effect, absolutely amazing antioxidant effect from this particular mushroom. And it's the black part, mostly you can see here, rich in the, like I said, the birch compounds, the betulin, highly antiviral, and been very well researched in flu. But it has to be boiled to have action. And to make the decoction, you have to use boiling water, and you need to soak it enough to mush it up because it is so hard. And then you have to soak it again for several days to see if you can soften it enough to use it. But if you can manage to get that, or you can manage to get an extract already done, about 250 to 800 milligram of 8-to-1 extract a couple of times daily can basically be used in cancer. It's a pretty amazingly beautiful black thing. Now, the other cool mushroom, which is kind of gross but kind of cool, is Cordyceps. Lots of people have heard about Cordyceps. It's a parasitizing fungus that infects either other fungi or insects. This particular version that I'm showing you the picture here for is of the fungus infecting an ant, or having basically blown the head off the ant. In essence, what happens, and the one that the Chinese use is mostly to the caterpillar, a silkworm. But it can be caterpillars of moths or ants or beetles. You can find Cordyceps actually in BC, and you can find it in Eastern Canada, but it's really hard to find any particularly big amount. And part of the reason for that is because, in essence, what happens with this fungus is that it infects the caterpillar or the ant or whatever, and then what that caterpillar will do as a consequence of its interaction with this fungus is it will, as the fungus grows inside of it, all of a sudden one day the caterpillar will decide to actually climb to the top of the tree. And when it gets to the top of the tree, it bites onto the top of the tree, and the fungus breaks out through its body, usually the head, and sprays its spores from high up on a tree. And so this is one of the reasons why it's hard to find a lot of Cordyceps, is because you basically have to climb to the very top of trees to even look for it. And of course, you'd have to find a population of insects that were infected by it. So nowadays, it's actually cultivated so that, and not necessarily in live creatures, more on another kind of growing medium that we know Cordyceps will grow on. But it's basically been used for thousands of years. It is extremely restorative to the hypothalamic pituitary axis. That means if there's big stress symptoms, especially where there's anxiety and hypertension, Cordyceps is a beautiful extract to use. It'll also decrease your blood sugar by about 55% in about 30 days. It can help with arrhythmia and heart issues. It's useful in lupus nephritis. That's where you're getting kidney failure from an autoimmune disease called lupus. It inhibits leukemia and melanoma. It stimulates testosterone. And like I said, it's super useful in diabetes. So absolutely amazing mushrooms. Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.